Wasdola Sura. I am Seraphis, defender of the Five Lions, and today I bring divination with the aid of my ancestral spirit, Nexus, while bound in this seal to keep the Archfiend at bay. I present to you this tome titled Godforsaken. I'm going to say this up front. Godforsaken is required. This is the only book outside the Cypher System Red Book that is co-designed by Monte and Sean, with additional design from Bruce and Shana. This is immediately clear from the page 1, as the book could practically be called a TSR D&D love letter. As in, that even though they present a setting-neutral design until the latter Godforsaken chapter, every aspect of design is just shy of making reference to original D&D settings when discussing using an existing setting or making your own setting. Well, let's go through this, shall we? Introduction. What's Your Fantasy is an introduction from the team on what the module presents, which is the freedom to make your fantasy setting yours. I feel like this is a concept that people of a younger generation might find more difficult to understand, because you get to be inspired by things you like. Don't just play Forgotten Realms or Pathfinder. Maybe you have fond memories of the 70s and 80s and watching Golda and the Golden Lance, the Herculoids, Masters of the Universe, and Thundercats, and want a world that has the fun and adventure of those cartoons. Then, well, shave the file names off and go for it. That's what I like here. The team are telling you, hey, go have some fucking fun. So, yeah, go have some fucking fun. Anyway, Part 1, Fantasy World Building, takes us through chapters 1 to 12 and basically teaches someone brand new about how to make a fantasy game. So, let's get started. Chapter 1, Building Your Fantasy Setting, as always, starts us off basically summarizing what this whole first part is, but it does bring up borrowing from other sources and using published fantasy settings. Page 11 has an amusing little sidebar here where they talk about how fun it can be to set an entire game in just a grand city. This is funny because this is the basic premise of Monte's published home game setting, Tolus. Chapter 2, Fantasy Plots, introduces the GM and the players, if they're all working together to make this game world their own, to the plot elements that will be driving the story. Examples, a lot from Shakespeare, are given here, though I would hope most GMs know how to make stories and plots by now. Chapter 3, Fantasy Character Options, begins with going over an actually decent sized list of classic fantasy stereotypes, aka classes, and gives suggestions on various ways that they can be created for a fantasy game in Cypher. This doesn't walk you through step by step, pick this ability, this foci is best, choose this type. Min-maxers will want to play this race descriptor to get the most out of it. No. The other thing, these also work as being replacement type names for your character too. Next, the chapter brings up new foci in this book, takes on animal shape, uses wild magic, walks the wild woods, and wields an enchanted weapon. And remember, all Cypher content is compatible with each other, so if you want to be, say, a Warforged Titan, you could grab the AI descriptor from the Stars of Fire Whitebook and the Grows to Towering Heights foci and reflavor them for a fantasy setting. This chapter also explains this too. Moving on. Chapter 4, Medieval Fantasy Equipment, starts giving us categories of pricing and items that many of a Dungeons & Dragons background or gaming circle would find familiar. I will just point out for my own home game here, I use a currency value system like Numenera's and use a modified version of the cash and assets table from Call of Cthulhu to give my players a daily wage they work off of based on their assets and stakes in the holdings of their keep. Anyway, I can't tell if the equipment chart on page 35 is basically the same as the list you find in Numenera and the Red Book, but it looks similar. And after all that, we go into weapon descriptions, which sometimes adds special rules to an item, so always remember to read these. After that, on page 37, we have sets of armor and their values, followed by armor descriptions too. And again, it pays to read these, people. And on page 39, we have adventuring equipment tables followed by descriptions. Now, this is basically rounded out the chapter as it goes into different bits of equipment by category, like clothes, companions and gear, and consumables. Chapter 5, Fantasy Gaming Inspiration, begins reading like a very similar section from a dungeon master's guidebook. It's almost like basically all of these people wrote stories and design systems for a game with dungeons, where you fight dragons. Anyway, it takes you through different types of fantasy setting themes, such as high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy, dying earth, fairy tales, historical fantasy, modern fantasy, paranormal romance, whimsical, and okay, I can't pronounce that word, I'm sorry. Oriental inspired fantasy. That, think Journey to the West, Mulan, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Chapter 6 Magical Rules Modules is where we start hitting rules for GMs and things players should know about the worlds they'll be playing in. The first point covered is anti-magic, and oh yeah, this is a page and a half of just on this. Because Cypher has such flavoured foci, many can be seen as overtly magical in a fantasy setting. So a GM should make clear with their players what kinds of foci are inherently magic based, which ones are inherently non-magic based, and which ones are in a grey area. Obviously, discuss this with your players when they create their characters. Next up in this chapter is crafting magic items, why people may want to craft over buying, and then how to craft ciphers. This is a 5-step process explained over 2 and a bit pages, but it boils down to this. 1. Choose the level of the cipher. 2. Determine the material costs needed on the table provided. 3. Assess the difficulty of crafting the cipher. 4. Determine the time it will take based on the provided table. 5. Complete the subtasks to craft the cipher in the time allowed. A special note here is that failure only results in time wasted, so you can keep trying to complete a crafting if you still have the time to complete it. Next up is crafting artifacts, and for the most part it's mostly the same as crafting ciphers, only it's also considered a long-term benefit and thus requires a cost of 3 XP. The only change here is if you want to create a game-breaking artifact, that the conditions of crafting the item increases by 20 times. So, discouraging people from being assholes. And by the way, given the artifact examples lists they provide later, their idea of game breaking literally is that. Remember, this is a game that has a completely compatible Necronomicon in it. Just saying. It also talks about why craft when you can salvage and loot, but explains that some people like to make characters who are just crafty. Look no further again than Numenera Destiny, where the right is 100% a crafting machine and Mr. Fix-It. It also discusses cursed items and whoa! I was just talking about the Necronomicon and then talking about cursed items? Okay, you know not to play with cursed items, so just don't. Moving on. Death and Resurrection is another section in here, and damn. Yeah, because of how Cypher works, this is about 2 pages all up on working out how to handle death and death in a fantasy setting. And that's death with a capital D. Next is Ritual Magic, and this is a massive section, and boy do I want to discuss it in depth, but let's try not to. Okay, so this talks about big magic, the kind where the mages gather together to do something big. These 9 pages go over the process, examples of magic rituals, costs and time, and all the good stuff. And now we have to come to our Eberron in the road. Magic and technology, in the same setting. Magic tech, magic plus tech, tech that interacts with magic, magic that interacts with tech, mind control and psionics, mystical martial arts, possession, secret and true names, and fucking finally, wishes! At some point, I'm going to come back and dive into ritual magic and all this Eberron goodness, because I fucking love Eberron. It's like the world of Indiana Jones, but all the adventurers are from Pirates of the Caribbean, and every enemy is Imhotep from The Mummy. It's crazy ass fun, and I love it. It's also not grimdark or steampunk. Few people will get off of 5e and read the original 20 plus source books for 3rd edition Eberron. You'd see how much the setting is an adventure of exploration and political intrigue. Whoops! Cypher review. Moving on. Chapter 7, Fantasy Rules Modules, starts off by talking the GM through how to award treasure, and I'm using that term broadly, like MCG also. We start by talking about gold, then manifest ciphers, then artifacts. Then they start on dungeons, castles, and keeps. What are the walls? What are the doors? What are the traps? Then disabling the traps. We then also get a list of common trap poisons, but they work as a list of general poisons too. In general, a GM chapter for sure. Chapter 8, Fantasy Species, hits off with a large sidebar first. Variant rule, 2 descriptors. This is because, yes, species is kind of a thing in fantasy settings. The CSR section on fantasy gave us the elf, dwarf, hellborn, and half giant, but now we get the catfolk, dragonfolk, lizardfolk, gnome, and halfling. You may have noticed no orcs. 2 things. 1. Orcs exist as an NPC, and you can make your own racial descriptor for them based on their creature entry. Or 2. Path of the Planebreaker and Planebreaker character options have the species descriptors in there that can be reflavored for orcs. So, yeah, pick an option and go. Chapter 9, Cypher Shorts, hits up the GM and players with some truly iconic adventure shorts. So iconic, in fact, that I won't even bother to tell you anything other than their titles. So, here goes. 1. Tavern Brawl. 2. The Thing on the Precipice. 3. Lost in the Dungeon. Chapter 10, Creatures and NPCs, is what's written on the box, from goblins to kaiju. I will add here, though, that something that MCG often do here is give these mythical and monstrous creatures their real-world lore descriptions. Why? Just to tell you about these creatures. So, you are then free to recreate these creatures as you want in your world that suits your setting, without the baggage of fluff from a specific setting getting in your way. Chapter 11, Fantasy Ciphers, starts off by giving a whole host of new ideas to think of ciphers. Not just potions and scrolls, but rune plates, tattoos, charms, powder, crystals, and a book with a single word of power within its pages of otherwise subject details. I love this, more than the ciphers themselves, honestly. Chapter 12, Fantasy Artifacts, goes in to explain artifacts for the class, before diving us into the list of fucking awesome artifacts. Here's just a quick short list of some of my favorites. Alchemist's Bag. The bag can hold a number of ciphers equal to its level. Book of All Spells. When you open the book, the page you go to gives you a spell-like ability to cast as you want. Fucking boom. Death's Scythe. Somehow you tricked Susan into letting you hold the scythe, then ran off with it. It's less Susan and more her grandfather I would be worried about, and yes, it's the only artifact in the system that can be a level 10. Demon Flesh. It's basically the Venom symbiote. Demonic Rune Blade. You say Demonic Rune Blade, I say Stormbringer. Flying Carpet. Actually, this is nothing surprising, I just like flying carpets. Ring of Wishes. So remember when I said about where's my ring Jin in the last video? Here, it's here. I have some minor tweaks to this item, but it's just to make it more usable, but limits its range too. Basically, making it a level 1, 2, or 3 item and limiting its wish range to difficulty 1, 2, or 3 requests, bringing it in line with the Aladdin story. Whisperer in the Ether, a crystal that allows you to communicate with an unknown, powerful entity with outcomes. By the great dragons above, between, and below, I love these designers. Moving on. Part 2, Godforsaken, takes us to the example setting for the genre, and it has an interesting premise. I do think that it comes off like Monte, Sean, Shana, and Bruce had a long brainstorming session and came up with this one. Because there's lots that, from my viewpoint, Godforsaken has that reminds me of previous RPG works from Monte, Sean, and Bruce, and from Shana's writings. As per usual, I won't dive into Godforsaken, but this is one that has a bit more interest to it, in the same way as the Revel from The Stars of Fire. So, jumping forward to Part 3. Part 3, Adventures, gives us 2 more adventures for the Godforsaken setting, but I feel that these can be used as much across other settings too, with some work. Chapter 19, Secrets of the Soulsmith, gives us an adventure around a mysterious character called the Soulsmith, his many undead, and complete a task for him before he'll hand over treasure to the party. Chapter 20, Within the Monstrous, is an adventure that takes the players into a family squabble with deadly intentions. Index lastly gives us an index. Yeah, no surprise. Well, that about wraps this part of the review up. So, my conclusion here is a little different than usual because most who play TTRPGs come at it from a fantasy perspective and with that as their intent. So, I can only recommend this book as the easiest way to get players into the system. Because of this, Godforsaken is required. Huh, that was weird. Anyway, thanks to everyone for listening or watching. Hope you enjoyed it compared to last week's episode. Next week, we take to the streets and watch the skies, for the superheroes have arrived in Claim the Skies. Till next time, Sarah, Nexus, end comes.